Hi, I'm Stuart Mowbray, editor of Gun and Sword Collector magazine.
And I'm Joe Puleo, technical editor of Gun and Sword Collector magazine.
And we are
The Gun Guys.
In this first episode of our Gun Guy Adventures, we're going to be visiting
The Providence Tool Company.
the Providence Tool Company in Providence, Rhode Island, of course, was at one time the biggest privately run arsenal in the world.
Yep, they not only made rifles for the Civil War, but they made almost 600,000 rifles for the Ottoman Empire in the 1880s.
So, it's off to Providence. Come on.
Yeah.
Let's go.
Providence Tool Company was founded in 1834 to manufacture nuts and bolts. By the outbreak of the Civil War, it was one of the most successful metalworking companies in New England.
Hey, where's that voice coming from?
The urgent need to arm hundreds of thousands of Union volunteers brought Providence Tool into the arms business. During the war, they supplied more than 10,000 light cavalry sabers and over 70,000 Springfield pattern rifle muskets to the federal government. Their profit was about $250,000, a huge amount of money at that time.
So here we have a successful but fairly small metalworking company on Wickenden Street in Providence. The Civil War comes along. They acquire a very large complex on West River Street, but they don't know anything about how to make guns. How do they handle that, Joe?
Very easily. They hired Frederick W. Howe, who's probably one of the greatest machine designers in American history. Howe had begun his career at Robbins and Lawrence, where, along with Richard Lawrence, he designed a great many of the machines that were used by the British when they set up the Enfield Lock National Armory in the 1850s. When Robbins and Lawrence failed, Howe went to work for Providence Tool, where he designed things like profiling machines and probably designed the first universal milling machine. In 1868, Howe went to work for Brown and Sharp and continued designing machines for the rest of his working life.
Now these guns that they were making, Joe, what model was that?
Model 1861 rifle musket.
Now that's a percussion gun?
Yes.
Excellent. Now this was the standard service arm of the Union soldier?
Yes, and in fact the contracts required they be identical to the product made at Springfield.
Now if someone wanted to acquire one of these rifle muskets today, how would they go about that? That's a pretty tough find, isn't it?
Not really. There's actually an awful lot of them in existence. They can be had, in some cases, in practically new condition.
Awesome, but what if you want one made at Providence Tool?
That's going to be more difficult. For some reason, and we don't know exactly why, Providence Tool rifles are a great deal rarer than they ought to be.
Interesting.
When the Civil War ended, John B. Anthony, the businessman who ran Providence Tool, decided to stay in the gun business. Back in 1864, they had purchased the rights to a new breech-loading rifle patented by Boston inventor Henry Peabody. It was an excellent design, but the war ended before it could go into production. Anthony still hoped to sell them to the U.S. Army, but even though the Peabody scored very well in tests, it was not adopted. The truth is, it never had a chance. In 1866, the nation's war debt was huge. Congress wasn't about to make any new arms purchases when there were already millions of rifles in storage. But John Anthony did not despair. Many European countries were rearming in expectation of war, and the company sent salesmen all over the world in search of orders. Over the next few years, Peabody rifles were sold to Spain, Switzerland, Romania, France, and Canada. They also armed state troops in both Connecticut and Massachusetts. Despite this success, by 1871, John Anthony decided to get out of the gun business because of increased competition from the Remington rolling block. Providence Tool Company's gun-making machinery was put up for sale, and they started making Singer sewing machines. but the lure of Turkish gold brought them back. In 1872, the Turkish Ottoman Empire was much larger than the Turkey we know today. Their army was simply huge, and they had no factories capable of making modern firearms. Whoever won their business would be getting the largest arms contract of all time, paid for in solid gold. Hoping to get in on some of this action, Anthony entered the Peabody rifle in the Turkish trials, but the Sultan, Abdul Hamid II, chose the British Martini Henry design. The British might have pressured Turkey into making this decision, presuming that the rifles would be manufactured in England, but they were wrong. Abdul Hamid opened the contract up to competitive bids, and the winning bid was placed by Winchester, but there was a big problem. Winchester did not have the facilities to make the rifles, and they had no legal right to manufacture them. Here's why. The Martini Henry rifle design was actually based on the Peabody rifle. Using the Swiss Peabody as a starting point, Swiss inventor Friedrich von Martini had developed an improved version that was self-cocking and eliminated the separate lock on the side of the rifle. The British Army adopted Martini's improved rifle, and it quickly developed an excellent reputation, so it was definitely a good choice for Turkey. But Providence Tool owned the Peabody patents, and Winchester couldn't manufacture the rifles without their permission. In fact, Providence Tool always referred to the gun as a Peabody Martini, which is a much more accurate description of its features. The suit was filed before Oliver Winchester's signature on the contract was dry. In order to get out of this mess, Winchester sold the contract to Providence Tool, propelling the sewing machine factories back into the gun business. It was the biggest arms contract of all time, eventually expanded to total around 600,000 rifles, about 500,000 of which were delivered. The demand for manufacturing space was so great that Providence Tool had to lease 2 additional factory complexes in order to get all the work done. But there were financial troubles from the beginning. Turkey constantly fell behind on its bills, and Providence Tool had to borrow money in order to survive the gaps between payments. Bankers loaned them the money against undelivered rifles, some of which were sold to Chile and Japan when the Turks were unable to pay for them. As it turns out, Turkey eventually paid in full, but the interest on these loans and associated added expenses ruined the Providence Tool Company. In 1882, they were forced to declare bankruptcy.
Because of all this financial turmoil, there were quite a few leftover rifles hanging around that never got delivered to Turkey. Because of this, it was pretty common in the old days to find Turkish contract rifles and their bayonets for sale in local sporting goods stores and gun shops around Rhode Island. As a matter of fact, we were recently approached by an elderly man who came across what he thought was a Civil War sword stuck in a tree out in the woods, but actually turned out to be a fairly beat up and rusty Turkish contract bayonet. So all of these weapons saw local use, both in hunting, and the bayonets became work knives, and they're still found today, often in spectacularly good condition. So when you see a Turkish contract rifle that's practically mint, you probably have one that never went to Turkey.
Lots of stuff was left over. I knew a man once who used to fire the boilers at the old Rhode Island Tool Company with leftover rifle stocks from the Turkish contract.
They were stacked to the ceiling. The drop hammer that you see here has been left as a monument to the industrial past of these buildings. Back in the 80s and 90s, when Joe ran a printing company across the railroad tracks from this location, I used to visit him there quite often, and you could hear it smashing and smashing with this big loud clanging noise. It's definitely one of my key memories from those years.
Well, we hope you enjoyed our visit to the Providence Tool Company. What's next, Stuart?
Who knows? Everyone will just have to join us on the next episode of Gun Guy's Adventures to find out.